Hello, chess fans. This is Brian Castro from Better Chess Training. In today's video for beginners, I'm going to be covering a few common mistakes that I see. I teach children and adult beginners how to play chess, and as well as my sons are starting to learn how to play now too. So I see a lot of common errors. So I'd like to show you a few examples and how you can go about rectifying and fixing them. So here is my game against a beginner. I'm playing white, and my opponent, who's probably been playing chess semi-seriously for about 3 months, so he's trying to get better, and we're playing a training game. So I'm not trying to crush him as ruthlessly as possible, but I am going to try to give him a good game and make sure that he is on his toes. So I start the game out with e5, and my opponent plays. I start with e4, and my opponent plays e5, and then I play knight to f3, and then he plays f6. Before we talk about why that is not a great move, let's take a look at what he could have played. Most common would be knight to c6, and then that could lead to a lot of things, including bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez, or bishop to c4, which would lead into the Italian game, or something like d4, which is the Scotch. So those would be the most common continuations from there. He could also play what's called the Russian defense, which would counterattack on white's e4 pawn, and this is also actually the second most common defense. And then finally, he could play the Philidor, which is d6, and it's not as common as the other two, but it's a perfectly valid opening. I think it lost a lot of popularity when the great Paul Morphy played his famous game where he won in 17 moves against the Philidor. But it's his opponent did not play very well, and so I think it's a perfectly fine opening. But let's go back to what he played during the game. F6 has the main defect. It does protect this pawn, but it has the main defect of making this diagonal weak. And we'll see later in the game why that is important. And it's generally important in these e4, e5 openings. Okay, when it comes to learning openings, I recommend that beginners first use a book that explains general opening principles and gives examples of the most common openings. I like Yasser Seirawan's Winning Chess Openings, and I'll put a link in the description. But any of the books that are out that are just general in nature with openings, I think would be very helpful. Another tool that you can use here is the internet, and I use Chess Tempo to do this. But it's basically using an online database in order to look up the openings and how common they are. So let me show you how I do that with Chess Tempo. And so here I go to Chess Games, and I'm looking at games where both players were over 2,200, so fairly strong players. And let's just plug in the game that we're looking at today. E4, E5, Knight F3. And now you can see here that the top move is knight to c6, okay, and in this database there are 124,000 games with knight to c6, followed by knight to f6, the Russian, which I showed you, and then the Philidor. And we can see that f6 was only played in 3 games here, and the last time it was played it was in 2005. So it's very rare, and as we will see in the game, you'll see why. But what you could do is take a look at this, and I wouldn't worry too much about these statistics, especially if you're using a game with mainly strong players. I mean, you do need to look at them, but I would, especially at the beginning, not look at this. For example, you might look at this and say, oh, well, black, you have to be careful about the conclusions you make about the statistics, okay? But you can see here that knight to c6, knight to f6, and knight to d6 are all played at master level, and they were all played in 2017. They were all played recently, so those would be generally be good openings to use. And then what you could do is you can look at the different options after that. Let's see, we can look at this. And then what you could do is look at the games and then sort by rating. And we can see here that our world champion has played the black side of this. And, if we want to take a look at it, we can go ahead and click on that game and study the game. This is a resource I think that you should use after you use some type of general opening book or instruction. And that way you can see what is played by strong players. And then okay, moving on with our game, I played bishop to e2, and my opponent played d6. This actually illustrates another thing because you'll see with his next move that is what his intention was, and he probably should have just played d6 on move 2. I castled here, and then my opponent played bishop to g4. And the idea here is either to attack this knight or maybe have this type of pin. He might have seen me play this before, like a pinning move, or he might have seen some of his friends play it. Not a mistake per se, but I think in this case it's not really a big deal because unless he's intending to take the knight, which might have its own strategic merits, he's not really pinning anything because this bishop is in front of the queen. So usually a pin would be against a piece with a more valuable piece behind it. So not a horrible move, but probably not the best move. I think in this case he probably could have just either played something like knight to c6 or maybe developed with bishop to e6. But again, not a bad move. Okay, I played h3 to see what he would do with that, and then he played bishop to h5. And here I think it would be better maybe if he just played bishop to e6. The reason why is that these pawns, this is what we call a good bishop because the pawns here are on dark squares, so it's not blocking this bishop. For example, this bishop at the moment is a bad bishop because these pawns block its movement. Okay, so this is a good bishop, and probably one he wants to keep in the game a little longer. However, he moved back to h5, and again, not a horrible move. And what I wanted to do here was kind of test what he knew. So I made a move here that would give him an opportunity to win material. And I played knight takes e5. And if you want, take a moment and pause the video and see what you would play next. Okay, let me show you what you could have played or should have played, and I'll show you what he ended up playing. In this particular position, the best move would have been bishop takes e2, and here black will just win material. If white takes back with the queen, then black can simply take back. Probably best to take with the d pawn. Actually, the probably doesn't matter that much. Actually, the f pawn is probably good as well. However, in this case, I can get this queen check in here, although he could just block. So, but this would be better because he's got two pawns in the center. If instead of taking the bishop, I tried something like knight to f7 to try to counterattack, then he can simply take the queen, and then after I take his queen, he can just take back, and then after I take back, black is up a piece for a pawn. So this would be winning for black. Okay, so the common mistake here is that we fail to see our opponent's threats, as well as not considering the alternatives when it comes to having a choice. So I wanted to show you a little exercise that I suggest to beginning players to help develop this habit. So what I do is I just grab a game, and it could be one of your own games or it could be a master game that you're studying. In this case, this is a game by Carlsen with Magnus Carlsen in it. But let me just show you what I do. I play forward the first 10 or so moves, basically until we get into a middle game. And let's see here. Let's go to move 10. And in this case, this is a game between Vallejo Pons and Magnus Carlsen from 2012. The idea here, though, is to practice identifying threats as well as um, defending pieces. So it's getting you more familiar with the relationship between the pieces. So here's what you do. In this case, it's black's turn to move, and white had just taken this knight. So what you would do here for white is consider what pieces it's attacking. Now, in this case, it is a recapture, so we could talk about that in a second. But the general drill would be we would look at what squares this knight can attack, and we could see it can attack e8, c8, b7, b5, c4. It cannot attack e4 because its own pawn is there, f5, and f7. And then we would look at what pieces could attack it. So in this case, the king cannot attack it because the rook is protecting it, but this pawn on c7 can. And then we would move to the next move here. And then we would do the same thing. Now for black, we would see, well, what can this pawn attack? And well, in this case, it can only attack c5. And what pieces can attack it? And we could see here that the rook can attack it here, and no other pieces can take it. And then we would go again. Now this bishop here, this bishop can attack along this diagonal as well as this diagonal, and it can attack this knight here. And in this case, there are no pieces that can attack it. And the idea here is that we just go through the game and play through these moves and practice identifying what squares are attacked and what pieces can attack that piece you just moved. And what this will do, you don't need to do this a ton. I think doing your regular tactical training on Chessity or Chess Temple will help with this. But what this will do will be to develop the habit or the instinct for your eye to just recognize threats and identify threats. And it might seem a little tedious at first, but after you do this for, say, a month, say you do one game a day, and it'll take you about 5 minutes, you'll start to notice that you'll start seeing these relationships between the pieces much more quickly and automatically. Instead, let's go back to the game. Instead, I think maybe he was intimidated by this knight on e5. He decided to defend the bishop with g6. And so, of course, this is a mistake. And I simply took it off. Bishop takes h5, and after he recaptured, queen takes h5 check. And again, this is all because of this f7 earlier, leads to mate in 2 after king to e7 and king to f7 mate. And this is another big mistake or common error that I see with beginning players, and it's the ability to recognize checkmate and mating patterns. And this is obviously a very fundamental skill because checkmate ends the game. So what I recommend here is to just practice checkmating problems. And I want to share this book with you, actually, one of my most used chess books. This is Chess 5,334 Problems, Combinations, and Games by Laszlo Polgar. And you can see it's a very thick book, but he is the father of the famous Polgar sisters, Judith, Susan, and Sophia, who are all very strong players. And he collects a lot of checkmate problems as well as combinations and short games in there. And he has mates in 1, mates in 2, and mates in 3. And I just think that going through them, when I first got this book, I would just spend 20 minutes a day going through. Actually, I did 5 mates in 1, and then I did 3 mates in 2, and then I would do 2 mates in 3, and those were my 10 checkmate problems I did each day. And I just went through it, and what happened was I was very quickly able to calculate checkmate. So I recommend you get a book like that, or see if there are some online servers that provide those types of problems for you to solve. Here's one of the problems from the Polgar book, and it is white to move and mate in 1. So if you want to pause it real quick and see if you can find it, then you can have some fun with that. Okay, the answer to this problem is knight to f7 mate, and you can see that the king is prevented from moving to either of these squares, and the bishop is pinned, so this is checkmate. By the way, if you thought it was knight to f5 check, it is not correct because the king can go to g5. So hopefully you got that. And mating patterns, it's not something you're going to have to do consistently for the rest of your chess career, but especially at the beginning, until you have those, until you could do it very quickly, I would suggest making it a regular part of your routine. So this was a quick game, but I think it was very instructive. It showed a few common mistakes that I see, and it all started in this case with move 2 after my opponent played f6. So hopefully he learned from that game, and hopefully you did as well. What are some of the common mistakes that you see in your play, whether you are a beginner or not? Let us know in the comments, and I'd love to start a conversation about that, and perhaps we can make some future videos to try to help you out. Also, if you enjoyed the video, please press the like button, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel for future updates. Thanks again, and see you soon.